Okay, so now I'd like to invite all of our speakers back up to the stage for a question and answer period. Don't go far. Now, if there are any questions from the audience, we definitely welcome them. There's a microphone right at the top of the center aisle. Alex is there waving her hand. So if you have a question, and we definitely would love to hear from the audience, please use the microphone so that our audience online can hear the question as well. Okay, well, thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I'll get started since we don't have anyone at the mic yet. One thing that I noticed that came up in each of your talks in different ways was this, I don't know if I would call it a theme, but there was an element of passion in her work in each section that you talked about. An interest in the sensuality of art and art making, not just in the subjects themselves. I mean, that was definitely there. Kate, I think this might be an interesting question for you about this idea of the sensuality and passion in the exploration of these, what I think for other American artists at the time were very cerebral kind of analytical questions, but it seems like there's something more going on there with hers that sort of goes beyond that purely analytic approach to the object and idea that you spoke about. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I would say you're exactly right about that. Are these on? Maybe. I can yell. But I think that for me, when I look at Kay's work, what really strikes me is the combination there. It's the fact that there is the affective, there is the sensual, there is the expressive, but it's combined with this extremely fierce intellect. And that what strikes me about reading and talking to Kay about the 1970s is how serious she was. I mean, for such an amazingly passionate, funny, warm person, you know, when you get into this discussion about grids, she gets, you know, cranky and says, I wasn't doing that, but of course maybe I was, but then, you know, and then you're just, you know, kind of undone by how deeply she's thought about all of these things. And so I guess my point is that I wouldn't want to say that, you know, Ad Reinhardt is serious and Kay is just sort of doing cool sensual stuff. I mean, I want to say that what Kay is doing is she's bringing that intellectual passion to a really rigorous exploration, and that this goes on for years. And so I'll leave it at that because there's probably more to say about it. I've skipped over the body to a certain extent and really just been thinking about process.
Yeah, I think that actually for those of you who are going to go up and see the exhibition afterwards, even the black-on-black charcoal drawings, which are very, very spare, have an incredibly rich, sensuous surface. So there's definitely, I think, that sense of her really just enjoying the actual art making. And she talks about how yummy the saponified wax made the acrylic, and just, you know, that sense of touch that you have throughout her work. Robert, you're a painter. I would love to know how her work inspired your own art practice.
Well, I would just like to reference Kay's work. From what I've known about her work in the beginning, and I began to see it, I found the layering of paint, the removing of paint, the scratching, the adding of stuff is very intense activity on the surface, on whether it's on masonite or on paper or on canvas. That kind of physical activity where actually your body is involved, you know, and that's one of the most important elements in my own practice as well. And I'm extending it with what I presume happens as well in decolonizing yourself. And I think decolonization, this new notion about people that have been conquered. And you want to free yourself, so you work rather physically on a lot of things. I know for myself, when I was in Paris and I would speak to myself while I was painting, for the first time, I realized that was one of my first notions about a way of decolonizing myself. I never realized that I was actually thinking in English when I was painting. And then I would speak to myself in my language. And that would actually free me. And I would realize that, hey, man, I'm decolonizing myself. And I also realized that when I taught Indigenous abstraction at the Ontario College of Art and Design, I would send my students out into the parks and have them collect leaves, bring them into class, fold them up, and imagine a pattern and start biting the leaves. This is a very old traditional practice whereby women were sent out when they reached their moon time and this is how they developed their beadwork patterns. And it's quite extraordinary what I send the boys out as well. And they would look at and they would open the leaves and then we will put them against the glass. So that's decolonization for me.
Oh, okay, Jess, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the theme of sensuality, because I think we maybe often kind of readily associate sensuality on a spectrum with sexuality and with kind of human-to-human, bodily, sensual relationships. But I think for me, some of the most exciting moments in Kay's work are when sensuality opens up to the rest of the material world, and in particular to land. And Robert, when you were speaking about the kind of tradition of American landscape painting, there is definitely, of course, a strong visual tradition that relies upon the sense of a sovereign body, right? A self that has clear boundaries that can then, gaze upon the land as something to possess. There's all sorts of directions we could go with that. But I think there's a way of, in Kay's work, of thinking about this kind of fleshy paint and the practice of painting and the way that figuration, her figures seem to so often kind of dissolve back into their material neighbors, that also allows for us to think about a different kind of subject in relation to place and land.
Oh, Lisa, you want to say something?
Yeah, I actually want to just follow up on something that Kate said that I think is really important. I mean, as art historians, at least some of us, you try to think about what's the motivation behind the artist making the choices that they make, and then what's the context. And I think the context here is really important because, of course, Kay was it feels so weird to talk about UK when you're right there, but but I mean, she was a young artist who wanted to make her mark, and so the seriousness that Kate was referencing, I think, had to do with the fact that A, she was a woman, and B, she was a Native artist, and she had been told in grad school to drop the Indian stuff and to be more serious with merging herself into the mainstream art world, which was dominated by minimalism and post-painterly painting and Clement Greenberg. And so I think what you really need to do is kind of look at those minimalist things with the really post-minimal things together, because it's her way of saying, Frank Stella said, what you see is what you see, but no, there's more there. And she sort of goes about and shows us there is more there. Even in the really flat things, there's still this subtle little scratching, and and it kind of takes issue with Greenberg, I would argue. But and I think she wanted to be taken seriously, and she kind of went through these different movements or dealt with these different styles that connected to the theories and what people were talking about as serious art.
Great,
So,
thank you. I actually see someone at the mic there. Come on
perhaps
up.
too short for the mic,
Yeah.
the way it is set up. I just want to continue this emphasis on texture, but with an observation that comes out of Jessica and Lisa's presentation, so I'd be interested in hearing you think a little bit about fresco. For me, one of the real revelations in seeing both of you focus on some of the inspirations for the Italian period work was how Kay's work makes me see the physicality of fresco. Rather than seeing the physicality of Kay's work, which is so visible upstairs and which in some of those works really takes on, because these are expansive pieces hanging vertically on walls, it takes on the sort of textural quality of physical walls, even as it's also got all these other things going on. But of course, the encaustic or the saponified wax acrylic medium is also taking the pigment into its very substance to build up the surface in the same way that frescoes are laid down. And both of you talked about fresco as the site of figurative representation, but it's actually the wall itself, right? The entire piece. I think about the way in which Diego Rivera insisted on learning this process and how complicated it is. I think there's a really interesting dialogue there, and I guess my observation is that she makes me see fresco differently. So this intervention in art history, this wonderful term that you came up with, Jessica, creative kinship, seems to me that both kin benefit tremendously from the family that you've created. But I also wonder whether you might want to think about ground in the frescoes as something that's meaningful to the kind of sensuality that you're talking about that could also help us get away from bodies as the only site of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I was going to say the one thing that I know, having while working on Kay's Italian work, I kind of followed her to Rome one year and had a great time, but and I can remember kind of following the footsteps that she went through during that sort of first time teaching and going to Pompeii and some of the cathedrals, and not having been at the time or thought of myself as a terribly religious individual, I can remember going into one of the grand cathedrals in Rome and looking up into the dome and the expanse across the transept and seeing, it wasn't a white dove, it was a pigeon, but flying across the top and feeling how the space affected me. And I think the same thing, like if you, in response to what I think what you're kind of pointing out there, Elizabeth, is when you go to see anything, any work of art in situ, that puts a whole different feel to it. And I think the sort of bodily scale of so much of her work, and then the way that you physically can kind of see and want to touch there, I think that has a lot in terms of, like, if you look at the frescoes and how when you walk through Pompeii, you get this kind of feeling, both with what's there and what you know used to be there. So, yeah. Yeah, no, I know. But what I'm also kind of putting out there is that it's like an installation too, in the sense that you kind of walk into this room, because when you are at Pompeii, you're kind of walking into the past. So, yeah, no, the textures of the frescoes themselves, but I think there's also just the whole kind of surrounding experience as well. Anyway, I don't know if anybody else.
Okay, I have another, I guess, kind of a conversation I want to have and go back to something actually that Robert referenced, was this idea of her work being a tool of decolonization. And some of the things that came up in Jess's talk and others about her really sophisticated engagement with Native art history, with Western art history, with Western artists' engagement with Native art and primitivism. And also, I think it demonstrates her resistance to being put in a box. You know, she's really crossing a lot of artificial boundaries, I think. And I think maybe this might be getting at some of what you referred to, Robert, in talking about her work being a tool of decolonization. So I guess I'd throw that out to the panel, is does her work represent decolonization with her art?
So one of the things that I've been thinking about, sort of lurking behind that phrase, creative kinship, that I used in my talk, is actually a long and very, of course, conflicted political history that has to do with the federal legislating of indigenous kinship bonds in this country. And it comes up, it's absolutely integral to the assimilation period in which Hartley and Awatsire and others are painting. And of course, it also goes back to the Dawes Commission and the Dawes Act of 1887, in which the US government was essentially attempting to break up indigenous communal land holdings into private plots and anchoring the privatization of land in federal identification numbers, right? Sort of individually atomizing and identifying who is Indian and therefore who can own land. And of course, Kay traces her own ancestry back to both sides of that commission and has written really eloquently about the long legacy, the sort of long arm of that legislation in everything all the way up to the Indian Arts and Crafts Law of 1990, where who gets to be an Indian painter is also sort of under the federal eye, right? And so in trying to think about forms of talking about belonging, forming alliances, even familial bonds, I think that is an area that art and art history can have a role in speaking to, and in particular, Kay's work. And just briefly, now I'm talking for too long. I have a lot to say about this topic, but I've been thinking about a really great essay by Cherokee literary scholar Daniel Heath Justice, who talks about the need to think about kinship as a verb, not a noun, as something that he says we create, we make, not something that can be statically kind of given or legislated around policing belonging in indigenous communities. So I'll let others speak.
Does anyone else want to respond to that, or we have about just a few more minutes. We have time for another question, but we don't have anyone at the mic. I wonder if you all have any questions for each other.
I just want to add something about the work of Kay. Her work has opened up art history in America and in Canada and everywhere. And I think part of that is because she can walk in both worlds, the indigenous world and the modern world. And that's also not to differentiate, but that indigenous is also very contemporary, you know. And I think her work has made a big dent in I mean, she was out there in New York, you know, along with Agnes Martin and other great feminist artists. Well, maybe they're not feminists, but they certainly are great artists, and they were out there, and they were on the. I was going to say street. No, they were out there working, you know, creating and experimenting. Sorry, Kay. They were. They were not afraid to get involved, to be out there and be counted, and experiment too. Women artists have, and I might sound very chauvinistic here, but are not afraid to experiment. They're the biggest rebels in the practice of art making, in the creative field. Just look at Elaine de Kooning, you know. Again, Agnes Martin, Georgia O'Keeffe, you know. And for us in Canada, we have Emily Carr, you know, etc. Anyways, I'm getting carried away. Sorry, ladies.
Okay, all right, well, great. This has been fantastic. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations.
Thank you, Kay.
Okay, so we're going to have a short break to stretch your legs and get a snack out there. Please be back in your seats by 3:15, and we'll resume the symposium at that time. Thank you.